the Nunaval people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining today. I pay my respects to elders past and present. I am Pranjali, the student representative at the DSAA and a PhD candidate at the Sorry, I'm very sorry. Very sorry. There was a technical glitch on my end. COVID is gone, but yet we keep sort of maneuvering all these technical glitches. Apologies for that. So, as I was saying, I'm Pranjali. I'm the student rep at the DSA and a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. And I want to thank you all for joining for the second session of our DSA monthly webinar series. If you're not a member of DSA already, I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our community. You can follow us on social media. Find us on Twitter, the handle being @DSA_Australia, and on LinkedIn as Development Studies Association of Australia. We host these informative webinars monthly, and so be sure to stay connected for the upcoming sessions. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Deborah Cummins. Deb is the founder and director of Bridging Peoples, a research agency focused on improving community engagement practices for humanitarian aid and development programming. She is the author of Local Governance in Timor-Leste, Lessons in Post-Colonial State Building, which was published by Routledge, as well as many other academic articles and research reports on a range of topics. She has a law degree from the University of Melbourne and has a PhD on local and post-colonial governance in Timor-Leste. Over the past 20 years, she has worked in Timor-Leste, Egypt, Turkey, and Syria, leading major projects to bridge the gap between large-scale programming and community lives. She currently lives and works in Dili, Timor-Leste. I couldn't think of anyone better to share insights with us today than Deb. Welcome, Deb. And for our audience, please feel free to submit your questions through the live chat box at any time of the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat and will address your questions during the Q&A session, which is reserved for the end. Over to you, Deb.
Thank you so much for your warm introduction, Pranjali. I'm just going to share my slides. Bear with me one moment. Is that coming through well? So thank you everyone for joining us today, joining both myself and Pranjali today for the second webinar in our monthly webinar series. As Pranjali mentioned, my name is Deborah Cummins, and I'm also the industry representative on the Development Studies Association of Australia's Executive Committee. So sitting alongside Pranjali and other friends on the executive committee. So thank you everybody for taking the time to learn a little bit more about us and to get involved. And I really do encourage all of you to get involved in whatever way makes the most sense for you. So before beginning, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land that I'm currently enjoying, Yuin land. And to pay my respects to the leaders, past and present, and to acknowledge as well that sovereignty in this land and in the lands all across Australia was never ceded. So I wanted to begin today to frame our discussion around the importance of community-based research. So as Pranjali mentioned, I started my career as a lawyer. And I very, very quickly moved into the social justice sector, where I worked for an NGO called Reconciliation Australia, which is all about the very tricky relationship, navigating the very tricky relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, as well as having a strong social justice element. And my job at the time, I was very early in my career, my job at the time was managing the Indigenous governance research project on a day-to-day basis. And I raised this job because it was my very first introduction to the realities of coexisting governance systems, that we have state-based governance systems that we're all accustomed to, and at the same time, we have customary governance system, which includes customary law, customary systems of leadership, customary systems, ways of relating to the world around us, to ways of organising our economies and social interactions. So this was I was incredibly privileged to have this very big job very early on in my career, and I was utterly intimidated. I was so terrified. And I spent the good first 6 months of my job feeling like I was pretty dumb, quite honestly, because a lot of my job involved going between community understandings and ways of organising themselves, ways of describing their relationship with themselves and with the state, and then going to Canberra, which is where our office was, and trying to bridge that gap and speak to policymakers about it. And it didn't work. It just didn't work, and I couldn't get why. We were all using the same sets of languages. We were all talking governance. I read and read and read, and I could not get my head around it until I realized, probably between 6 to 9 months into my job, that while we were using the same set of languages, we were not using the same concepts. And that was a real issue because it meant that we weren't speaking to each other, which meant that we couldn't take the necessary steps forward. So my frustration grew and grew until I decided, right, I've just got to really double down and look at this. And I did my PhD on local governance, on post-colonial local governance. And I chose Timor-Leste at the time. That was many years ago. So that photo, I think, is from 2008, where I'm visiting a local schoolhouse in Timor-Leste. And my PhD was basically exploring, okay, well, how are communities organising themselves? How are they managing themselves? What does this new system of democracy and the state look like for them? Because Timor-Leste had only gained full independence from 2002, with the idea that when we understand community realities in a nuanced, intricate way from their perspective, then we can slowly build up and contribute to policy discussions, rather than doing what I was doing previously, where I thought, oh, we're using the same words, so that must mean we're having the same conversation. We were not. So this was my period of going back to school, which was an utter privilege. It was delightful, and it really set my path going forward. So I often start conversations with people around discussions around why aid and development projects fail. Most of the time, it's not because of technical effectiveness. It can be, but most of the time it's not. These projects are well designed most of the time from a technical sense. So you have all of your different aid implementers. You've got governments, you've got international organisations, you've got NGOs, you've got social enterprises, etc. And they are, to the best of their abilities, designing programs in order to meet a particular set of needs in communities. And we generally talk about those from a sectoral point of view. So we have in this little infographic a few examples, and it's not a definitive list, but you've got humanitarian aid, you've got livelihood support, environment, social protection, others. And this tends to be how people working in the sector think about aid and development, okay? So we gather resources, we pull together a project based on whether we're working in an international organisation or a foundation or whatever. We take, we sort of organise ourselves according to where we fit into this ecosystem. We design a project, and then we will implement those with local communities. This is the mainstream view of local development, but if we begin to look at things from the community perspective, we see that it's very, very different and much more complex than is commonly understood by those who are implementing or designing these projects. So you've got a whole bunch. And again, this infographic is not definitive. It's just a few examples of different factors which can really shape how projects are implemented, whether they fail, whether they succeed, and in what ways. So you've got ethnic and clan leadership, you have local conflict, which can go on for many generations. You've got village councils, you've got a subsistence economy, which is often not understood, not measured. You've got religious leaderships, you've got the private sector, all of these factors, whether customary, whether state-based, whether something in between, they all come together and they are the ecosystem for the community. They are how the community work together. And this is important to understand because it has some very practical implications. First, going back to my little story earlier, aid and development tends to support a particular worldview. It's not deliberate most of the time. It's simply the baggage that we bring in as we're designing a project or doing a needs assessment or implementing certain activities. Most of that time, that worldview is very Western. It's small L, liberal, it's capitalist, and it doesn't necessarily mesh well with community realities. At the same time, when you have a project, so imagine this is a community, you've got a project which is coming in, it is implemented in the community. As soon as it enters that community, it becomes part of that ecosystem. So resources are used in unexpected ways. Leadership arranges themselves around these resources, around the power that comes with a project or program. It reshapes the impact of projects on the ground. And this is what we at Bridging Peoples have been working on for the past close to 10 years now, and before then that I was researching. And this is important as well for us as researchers, because if we can understand and really take seriously, not just understand and say, oh, isn't that interesting, but really take seriously as part of local politics, these local forces, this can help our understanding of what's going on when projects are being implemented. Alternatively, if we ignore it, we're ignoring it at our peril. We're totally ignoring a good 50% of what's going on, more often, and we're inviting failure. So here's a couple of different examples of, and they're drawn from real examples of the work that we've done at Bridging Peoples over the past decade. So if you think about policing, for example, very often policing, community policing programs are put together, but they don't engage well with customary law. And they don't engage well with those that are implementing customary law. Most of the time, the design won't speak very much about that. And you only tend to see success when you've got really smart people on the ground who just know it, who are intuitive about it, and who they take it upon themselves to engage with those who are the customary law authorities and other local leaders. Another example might be if you put together a project around agriculture, but forget to or don't even realise that customary land tenure is a really important part of how agriculture is implemented. So you've got an agricultural project, you put in a lot of work technically around improving efficiencies, etc. But if you don't know how people relate to their land, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, who they need to ask permission of, what type of tenure they can themselves claim, at what times of the year. Perhaps there are certain times of the year where they can't. Perhaps there are local environmental standards which mean that they can't do certain things that you may not be aware of. That can really impact on the implementation of a project like this. So we have a number of different ways in which we can do research in the aid and development sector. Here's a few examples. Again, not a definitive list, but a few different examples of very practical ways in which we can use our research skills, and where it's really important that we begin to take, even if it's not 100% focused on community-based research, that we also take seriously the community side and the community perspective of things. So you have policy and context analysis. Very often, those are put together based on a set of questions which are developed in the office. Very often they won't reflect what communities consider to be important. So while you might have a set of questions which are asking community members, what they think about certain things, that might not be their priority area. You've got perception surveys, a similar a story there where you've got a preset of questions that you've already designed, implementing in community. Sure, it gives you some information on what's important from the community perspective, but if those questions aren't broad enough, then they're certainly not going to give a lot of information that could be really, really useful for you, because we only get answers to the questions that we ask. You've got sectoral research, so that's the type of research which is often put in order to, or implemented in order to really help programming decisions. So it might be, as a project is being implemented, someone says, oh, we need to know more about how teenagers are making their food choices. So can a researcher come in and do this, please? Oh, we need to know more about how people are using roads, and particularly those from marginalised groups. Can someone come in and do this, please? So this is another area of research that we commonly undertake. There are needs assessments, which are done ideally, not always, but ideally at the beginning of a project, in order to get a good understanding of where community needs are, where the gaps are, in order to develop programming around that. Very often, again, sort of coming back to only getting one side of the equation, very often these needs assessments tend to forget the strengths of communities. They will a bit, but the questions are predefined from the office. Very often people at regional level or higher will have had input as well, but the community members themselves have not had much input on the questions that are being asked. So while they'll give the best answers that they can, it may not be all of the information that you need. All of the research which is done on an ongoing way and at specific times during a project's life cycle, you've got monitoring and evaluation. So you've got needs assessments, you've got a baseline assessment, you've got midterm evaluations, you've got final evaluations, you've got inline, which is basically final. You've got ex post evaluations, which can be some time after that, looking at the impact and the sustainability of a particular intervention. All of this, although we use different terminology, it is all research. What we're doing is we're asking questions where we want the answers. We're asking them of particular people in a systematic way, and we're getting those results, and then we're packaging them in order to inform decision making. Advocacy support as well is another area which is very, very commonly used. Whether or not, again, it's used, the term research is used. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but there's a lot of research which is done in the advocacy sector, in the NGO sector, the non-governmental organisational sector, where people are, one, wanting to know how people are responding to a particular area of community life, and two, also wanting to know how they should be representing people's voices. A question I'm very commonly asked is all community research community-based? And the answer is no. There is a big difference between doing community-based research and doing research in communities. And I'm hoping you're beginning to get a bit of a feel for some of those differences now. Very often the easiest way of explaining it is that one is really sort of looking to engage with communities, work with communities, whereas the other is much more extractive, going in, getting the answers that you want, and then leaving again. There's not much in terms of relationship building, and there's not a lot of effort being made to reflect on a worldview other than the research teams and their organisation, which has asked for the research to be done. And this matters because it comes to those really basic questions around whose voice matters. In aid and development, whose voice matters and whose voice is heard. Most of the time, the voices that are heard are those of us working in the sector, rather than community members who should be taking ownership of the things which are happening in their community. Whose analysis matters. Same thing. If it's only coming from those of us working in the sector who may or may not be of the culture of the communities that we're looking to serve, we'll miss a huge amount. Questions around how to create analytical space for divergent worldviews, like I was talking about earlier. Sometimes realizing, taking that that baby step of realizing, oh, there are different worldviews. The way in which I see things is not the only way to view this area of work, to view this area of social life, of economic life, of political life, whatever it is that you're looking at, that community members themselves have their own, sometimes the same, sometimes very, very different, sometimes messy, sometimes not, view of this particular set of questions from their perspective. And that perspective is informed by their worldview, which really is what we talk about in academic terms, epistemology. It's epistemology. It's a way of looking at the world and understanding and engaging with the world. So here are a few examples of community-based research that we've done at Bridging Peoples. I'm more than happy to, in fact, you can just go to the website, which is at the bottom of these slides, to have a look. We've got it all there, links there. So we've done research into community experiences of decentralized development. So the idea that like sort of subnational or development which is happening at the sub-district or suko, or sorry, my village level. So looking at community experiences of how that's working, looking at the civil law needs of domestic violence survivors. So that particular piece of research was around finding out the stories of women who had survived domestic violence and how they had navigated the very messy, complicated and difficult space of community justice, which includes both customary justice and state-based justice. Driving factors for teenage pregnancy and early marriage. So in this bit of research, we went out and we had a chat with people about basically asking them to tell their stories. What happened? What was your life like previously? What were your dreams? How then did your life unfold? And what were the various obstacles that you had to navigate? And how did that then lead you to become a teenage mother and potentially marrying earlier, sometimes not? Similarly, we conducted research into the driving factors for transactional sex in Timor, looking at what it was that was bringing girls, in particular young women and women, into this very sort of informal area of sex work, because that's quite important to understand from a public health perspective in terms of HIV transmission and transmission of other sexually transmitted diseases. We've also done work we did work in Syria looking at the impact of humanitarian aid on local economies. So taking a very different perspective, looking at not only how the effectiveness of the aid which was being delivered, but what did that then mean for local economies? Because very often people presume in a conflict zone, in a war zone, that there is no economy. I can remember an economist, very well-noted economist, when I was trying to engage him on the topic, he was saying, but it's conflict, there's no economy. Of course there's economy, where there's people, where there's money, where there is value exchanging hands, whether or not it's money, it could be subsistence, there is economy. So we were looking at the potential negative effects on local economies in order to improve the impact of humanitarian aid programming. Looking at young people's participation in elections, what motivated them to get involved in, this was in Timor-Leste, to get them involved in the democratic process, what they thought of their leaders, what they whether they had aspirations to become leaders themselves. And this was inspired because at that time in Timor, we suddenly realized, oh, the independence babies are just about to vote. So those who had been born after 1999, when there was the popular referendum, the vote for independence, those who had been born were just at the threshold of being able to vote for the first time. So we wanted to check their pulse. And again, this was a very broad, open style of research in order to gather their perspective, including their perspective on local leaders, which included customary leaders. GEDSI and rural roads. So GEDSI is short for gender equality, disability and social inclusion. This is quite a recent piece of research that we've done. It hasn't yet been put up on the website, but looking at the accessibility and the security for people with disabilities, for women, for members of LGBTQIA plus community, their experience of using rural roads and what needs to be changed from their perspective in order to be able to safely use roads and therefore to be able to safely access very basic rights such as schools, health centres, work and other things. So you're getting an idea of the types of research that you can do, which can take that community-based research approach. Another one as well, I'm going to flick down to the last two here, coastal change and community preparedness, looking at the impact of rising sea levels on communities. This is a recent ex post evaluation that we've done. And finally, one also on the potential application of traditional knowledge to anticipatory action, which is part of disaster risk reduction and what it is that communities, that people can do in the not in the long-term preparedness stage, but in that stage where it's become clear, okay, we've got a problem. What can we do now in order to save ourselves, to save our assets, to save each other from this impending disaster? And for completion's sake, I probably should mention, because it's the only one I haven't yet, a market-based food environment assessment, which sounds very boring, but actually it wasn't. It was looking at the impact, well, the importance for nutrition programming of markets, of food markets and people's access to food markets. And it was quite interesting because, again, it was one of those situations where the programming had been based on the presumption that people are getting their food from markets. Sure, some of them were, but there's a lot of food which is being sourced via the subsistence economy, and it was completely missing that. So again, the data that was coming in through their ordinary monitoring and evaluation systems was incomplete. So I want to speak about some of the challenges or potential challenges in doing community-based research. The first of which I think is to deal very head-on with the myth of objectivity. It is the holy grail in research. We like to talk about research being objective of, oh, we run a survey, numbers don't lie. Yes, they do, because it depends on the questions that we ask. There is a real myth of objectivity, but that doesn't mean that it's not systematic and that we can't be rigorous about how we do research. So we can, to the best of our ability, attempt to build in neutrality. We can, to minimize the impact of our worldview in how things are being interpreted, to minimize the impact of how I'm thinking about a particular problem, and to incorporate other voices. So that involves dealing with bias, recognizing that all of us come with our baggage. We come with our bias. We come with our particular ways of thinking, and it's not a sin to have that. It's normal. It's human. But as researchers, what we do is we try to build in processes to make sure that it's not, oh, Deb says that this is how it is, so this is how it is. No, we need to bring in a whole multitude of different perspectives in order to build a broader understanding, which will always be incomplete. Research is always incomplete, but at least we can build out and broaden our understanding of particular areas of life. Another one, which I think, look, honestly, having been a researcher for 20 years now, I still struggle. Every time we start a new research project, I know that little feeling of anxiety in the belly. Oh, I don't know if this is going to work or not. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know the information that we're going to find in community. This could be an absolute dud. And my clients, people who are accustomed to working in very systematic ways, so people working in one of the UN offices or one of the NGO offices or whatever, saying, oh, but what about this? But what about that? And how can we deal with this area of community life? And each time I have to say, don't put the cart before the horse. Excuse me. Do not put the cart before the horse. We don't know yet, and we have to get comfortable with not knowing. And from a technical sense, in terms of research, one of the best things that you can do, if you're allowed to, if you can, if you have the resources and the space, is to build an iterative process. Do it in steps. So that way you can go out and you can find a little bit, you can come back, you can all talk together if you're working as a group around what it means. And then based on that, come up with new questions, go back out, check that out as well. And step by step by step, you will be able to build a more complete picture. At the same time, people, this is a really useful way of being able to triangulate the findings, to make sure that the findings are robust, etc. And most of the time, honestly, that's how I explain it to our clients. But the real reason is because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we're going to find out. This is risk management. We need to go out, we need to find out a little bit, we need to come back, we need to talk about what that means and then go out again. And that might happen 2, 3, 4 times. But it's not a comfortable feeling. Negotiating with clients as well can be a real challenge. And these days, this is primarily my job. I have a wonderful team of researchers who are like in our team or office, all teamerees, so they're much more appropriate to be going out and doing this work with communities. They get insights that if I go out, I won't get. So, I'm the office gal these days. But a key thing is to recognize and come with empathy to clients when you're engaging with clients. If you're feeling that little bit of anxiety, if you're a little bit scared, imagine how much more scared they are. They may not know you. They may not know your process. They may not understand why it is that you're suggesting a certain way of going about things. And so your job as well in this part, because we're operating in the real world, and if you were to decide to do research in a non-academic area, such as aid and development, where you're constantly engaging with clients, be empathetic and become their ally. Figure out, ask those questions early around what they're most concerned about and how we can mitigate those risks for them, how we can make sure that, you know, we're communicating regularly, etc., and build their ownership over the methodology from the very beginning as well, to the extent that they have the time to be able to give that to you. Look, sometimes you'll find people who just say, go do it. But most of the time you already need a relationship with that person. They need to know you and to trust you a little bit. So yeah, it's a very, very common thing where you'll have clients that they might appear difficult, but it's probably just that they're scared too, and they have to justify all of this to their bosses, become their ally. So how do we do community-based research? There's some basic principles. One of them, really, I've set this up as questions. One of them is to think about the central research question, the central focus. Is it open enough, or is it only focused or not providing space for worldviews outside of my own and my team's? Does the methodology create space and shift power? And so certainly shift power to if you're in my position and managing a team, shift power to those who are doing the field work, but through them as well, shift power ultimately to community members themselves, because who knew? Community members are experts in their own experience. Harness that, leverage that, learn from that. I'm often astounded at how, yeah, I am astounded at how often we get the compliment, oh, that research piece, that was so smart. And look, I like it when our team's called smart, but my answer is always, that's only because it came from community members. This isn't ours. And also asking yourself, does the analysis and your analysis process allow space to reflect community worldview? So asking the right questions. A common research question, I've deliberately taken questions that are actually drawn from our experience doing different research projects. So one was described, we have a health problem. Why aren't community members using health centres? Because we've got a spread of a particular disease that we need to deal with. So you could use that question and you would get some responses to it, but you could, as we did, talk about it in terms of what are community members' health-seeking behaviour. If you focus only on the column to the left, you're only looking at health centres. You're only looking at a particular modality of getting help for health needs. Whereas health-seeking behaviour can include those community members, including within the customary sphere, within the traditional medicine sphere, who are really having a huge impact on community lives. We have a stunting problem. How can we improve access to food markets? This was the example of the market-based food environment assessment that I talked about. Instead, talk about how do community members access their food. So this allows you to get into the subsistence economy. What police services are needed to improve access to justice versus how is justice provided in communities, and where are the gaps and how can this be improved, and where are the strengths? What technology do farmers need to improve agricultural yields? Instead, ask what are the enabling and constraining factors for farmers who are looking to expand? Go in and ask that question. You're going to get a whole bunch of different answers, some of which people will not have considered. You've got methodology choices as well. So there are ways to shift power to participants. You can use participatory rural appraisal tools. You can use storytelling, and there also has a strong ethics approach element to this, because through shifting power to participants, you are then able to bring their voices more effectively to people who are influencing their lives, who they'll never meet and they will never get the opportunity to engage with directly most of the time. Another thing is to make sure that you build into the process absolute respect for local realities, which means taking a strengths versus a deficit-based approach, and selecting participants carefully. So making sure that you're not just going to the immediate tried and true people within, holding particular positions within the community. Go broader than that and go iteratively. Ask people, well, if you were doing this research, who would you ask? Who do you recommend we speak to? And that's when you find different people that otherwise you wouldn't have gotten access to. It wouldn't have occurred to you potentially, and where you can get really interesting and important insights. And then we've got questions around analysis, whose voice matters. Again, coming back to the methodology, because we have certain methodologies in which analysis is built into the methodology. You've got certain participatory rural appraisal tools. Storytelling is another way of making sure that you're building people's analysis of their own experience into the stories that you're collecting. You can take that all the way through to gathering those people and having them analyze the information together and talk about their stories collectively. We've also played with voting. Well, more than played, we've implemented it in a number of different projects where you bring people together via a focus group discussion. They will ask a very broad question: what is your experience of? They will come up with a whole bunch of different things that you just write on Post-it notes, put together in a theme, and then ask people to prioritize based on their experience, rather than you taking that information back and you prioritizing it from your experience. And it can bring very, very different results. We commonly use as well analysis workshops. So at minimum, if we don't have the opportunity or the resources to be able to bring community members into the analysis process, then at minimum, immediately after fieldwork, the team will come together and we'll talk about what it means from their perspective, because at least we can, we don't have that divide between fieldwork and analysis, which is very often the case. Very often field workers are considered as data collectors. They will be paid to do a certain job, implement interviews, give you the data, and then a different team will do the analysis. And you're just asking to miss so much information if you do it that way. Instead, bring people together. People are smart and they will have a lot of ideas around the information that they've gathered that otherwise you wouldn't get the opportunity to talk about. We also implement stakeholder workshops, which they're a common tool, but we do it a bit differently, where we'll bring together community members with policymakers so that they can talk about their experiences directly with policymakers. It's a way of being able to build direct links between community members, have them feel that their perspective is being heard, and also to build empathy with policymakers and program implementers so that they can begin to put a face to the work that they're doing. And we're also finally this year beginning a pilot that is called the Cultural Intelligence Collective. And the idea here is to work with, and we've begun already with a set of volunteer researchers, a set of young researchers in Bridging People's Timor office, who are going out and they're accompanying farmers and community mobilisers in their work around water conservation across the country. And the focus is to work with the farmer researchers themselves. Certainly the volunteers will get kudos and experience, etc., but the focus is to support farmer researchers as experts in their own experience, and over time begin to build in carefully artificial intelligence so that the analysis and the writing side becomes easier and easier, and we can begin to put much more focus on the on the fieldwork rather than the analysis. Instead of having the stars, this research was authored by, have it as a collective effort. So thank you very much, everybody, and I would be delighted to hear any questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Deb. It was, I have so many questions. I am also monitoring the chat, but I think I'm gonna just ask my question to you first while we have our audience write to you. But before that, I wanted to tell you that it felt very reassuring to hear that even after 20 years of research, you still get those butterflies, you still get
Oh,
those
yes.
anxieties, because I think, I'm a PhD student. I've done a bit of research before, and I'm very like new to this space still. And these feelings are very real, and they sort of also guide the way we land up approaching our research. So yeah, it was very reassuring to hear that that is a very legitimate feeling even after so many years of being in this space. And particularly the table that you presented, where you how the questions could be asked, the alternative questions, as how open it could be, that was also very useful to visualize how can we draw out more nuances from these very wide, open-ended questions. And that actually helps us get better insights from the community and make it more community-based than just doing research on communities. So with that, I have, oh, okay. We have a question from Kate. So I'm going to give Kate the floor first, and then I'm going to ask mine. So uh, Kate Neely writes, thanks, Deb. Can you talk about the need to feed information back to communities that have participated in research?
Incredibly important. And thank you, Kate, for asking that question. This is important on so many different levels. It should, at minimum, be a basic question of ethics that people who are giving voluntarily their time and their insight and their intelligence, their wisdom to help you in your work, they should get the information back to them. It's also really important because, and you can do it in different ways. You can actually build this into the iterative process as well. If you have the potential to be able to do it, you can not only do the research, like do the analysis at the end, and then bring back a final, polished piece of research, presenting it in a manner which makes the most sense for them, because not everybody can read and write, but people certainly know about their experiences. So it might be that it's more of a verbal thing, more of a discussion thing that you do. But regardless, it's always important at minimum to bring the research report back to the communities that you engaged with. But you're leaving a lot on the table if that's all you're doing. If you want to actually get people's analysis around what these things that you're picking up means for them, build that into the iterative process as well. Make sure that those people are being included in the analysis process. So this is another way. It doesn't mean don't bring back the final research report. That should happen. That should be an absolute minimum. But do more. Bring people together in workshops. Bring people together during various analytical discussions. If you can, as we're trying to do in this cultural intelligence collective, actually recognize community members themselves as experts in their own experience, as researchers. And our plan in this pilot is to actually have the farmers themselves present the information, the research, the data at an international conference in July. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Ethically, important. Practically, even more so.
Linked to this question actually is another. There are two, so I'm going to read them back to back, and maybe you can combine your answers. So B. Fernandez writes, Yes, thanks, Deb. And related to Kate's question, can you talk about how this links to action? I think part of it you answered already, but if you want to carry on. And there is another question by Hemi Chaka, so the comment is, I think the above two questions are related to data sovereignty. I would be interested in hearing your experiences in this area, the
Yeah.
current landscape and discourse around data sovereignty in Timor, and the examples you might be able to share.
Yeah, that's really important. First, going back to the question around action, to me, I know it's not for everybody, and this is simply my own perspective, but to me, the only reason to do research is if it's going to help people, bottom line. So it has to inform action in some way or other. So being strategic, and this does take a bit of time and experience to learn how to link the insights you're getting from community members to what policymakers and program implementers need to learn. But you can actually ask for community members' help in that. Very often they can. Community leaders can really help to interpret those findings together with you. But yeah, to me, look, theoretical research is great for those who are working in that space. I don't. And for me, it has to improve community members' lives. Data sovereignty. We're not good at it, and we need to get so much better. One of my concerns, in fact, around, and the reason that we are doing the cultural intelligence pilot, one of my concerns with the potential impact of AI is that it will actually decrease people's ownership over their data. It could. So I think that we need to have a lot of really deep conversations as practitioners in this field around whose data it is. We've already done a fair amount in particular areas. And when I say we, I should in fact say others have done a lot of work in this area. So First Nations, Indigenous researchers have certainly done a lot of work in this area, a lot of advocacy in this area. They're very often still not, it's not considered mainstream thinking yet, and it should be. It should be a fundamental question for all of us. Whose data is it? It's not mine. It's not my clients. It is the data of the people who have provided it. And we need to be really careful, particularly as we're moving into a very different chapter of doing research. I can't predict how research is going to look with the impact of AI, but I do know that there are opportunities and I do know that there are massive risks. Data sovereignty is one of them.
I think I'm going to ask my question because it's kind of leading to the one that you were answering. Um, I'm curious to understand how do you navigate or balance, your positionality as a researcher when you have these donor or client demands, and then you have community expectations. Um, yeah, pretty much because I think you mentioned in your talk that your clients don't know you always. They don't know your how you do research, why you choose certain methodologies. But also as a researcher who does community-based research, you have certain principles or certain
Yeah.
methodologies you prefer. So how do you sort of maintain that, balance that, while at the same time sort of getting to fulfilling, let's say, what your client wants, as well as, you have the community part of the process as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question, and the flip side of my very practical approach to research is it is never perfect, and I am never ever going to say that it is. We have limits of time, we have limits of money, even if very often when we're passionate about a particular project, we'll throw in pro bono work. Absolutely, because to us, impact on community is the most important thing. But going to that question around navigating expectations, of clients versus the very real obligations that we have and should be holding ourselves accountable for in our engagement with communities. It's tricky. I mentioned at the very beginning when I very briefly told my story around how my experience in the early days of my career was perspectives were just miles apart. And this came, so that can be improved. And there are very specific tactics that you can take as a researcher to improve that. First, have the conversations before you even take the project. Don't just accept a TOR as it's presented to you. Pick up the phone, send an email. And if people aren't willing to have that discussion, maybe it's not for you. Where Bridging Peoples is not a huge agency, and I don't ever want us to be, because we are niche. We don't take every project. I could confidently say we say no to 3 out of every 4 that we're presented with. And we're in the privileged position of being able to do that. So again, nothing is perfect. When we started, it wasn't that way. And then to have the conversation first with clients, certainly before you sign the contract, and then afterwards around as well, what do you need out of this? Because we want to make sure at the end of the day that you're happy. Most of the time, what they need out of it is perfectly reasonable. We need to know why people aren't, why we have a stunting problem. We need to know why there are so many teenage mothers and what they need. We need to know what types of support farmers need. We need to know what types of access to justice support survivors of domestic violence need. Very often, those objectives are great. It's when you start getting down into the weeds and people, clients not yet trusting you and trying to change questions and methodologies that you have to push back. So get them involved at the very beginning in articulating very, very clearly what they want. Sometimes, very often, in fact, people will ask consultants to come in because they got no idea. So they're asking you to help them to define what it is that they want. And so do that, document it all. And one of the things that we do, which is very different to the ways of working for most research agencies, at least that I'm aware of, is we've got an extra step, which is a conceptual framework document. So it's a literature review. It's all of the things that you need to do at the inception phase of a project, but it's also thinking very, very deeply about epistemology, about worldview. And you start to throw those things in to that document. It helps people feel safe. It also does really help structure the methodology and approach and tools that you take. Another thing is the iterative process that I spoke about. Sometimes clients don't want it, they get cranky at it, but it does really help. Particularly if you can sort of present results at different stages and get their feedback as well. So they're really buying into the process. Finally, I think, well, probably not finally, I'm sure that there's a million other things that you could do, but one other thing that springs immediately to mind is draw on their empathy as well. If you can, in the early stages of fieldwork, start to and again, this is very often my job. I'll just get on the phone. It's not formal interviews or meetings. It can be, but I'll just get on the phone and say, "Oh, so there's some really interesting findings coming out. Do you want to hear about it?" And then tell a few stories. And stories draw people in like nothing else. And so as soon as you've got them drawn in, then you're showing your allyship with them, but they'll also be an ally for you. And hopefully, if they're good at their job, push back on their bosses.
Yeah, these were great practical tips, not trips. Sorry, I went into a trip myself when I was listening to you, and I was really thinking that, last question. What do you wish someone had told you when you first started Bridging Peoples? Because you have 20 years of experience now, And if you were to look back, go into that trip that I was thinking about, um, yeah, something, because that would then also, if somebody is, some early career researchers or somebody who's looking to enter the space or set up their own organization or just know more about what it entails to be part of this 20-year-old journey. Yeah, something that you wished you were told when you started.
I think, thank you for that very tricky question. It's not something that I think about that much these days, but the first answer that comes to mind is trust yourself more. The mistake I made at the beginning was, even though I had my head and a lot of experience working in this community-based way, and I had my head in that, and I knew and know the importance of starting from community experiences, etc. I think I was so panicked at the possibility that bridging peoples might fail that I didn't trust myself enough, and I didn't have the hard conversations with clients, and I didn't push back in the appropriate ways at that time. I was trying to just kind of almost sneak in the community-based stuff to what they had already planned, instead of saying, hang on, what's the impact that we're all looking for here? That comes with experience. But yeah, particularly if you're coming into the field with something like a particular set of values that you're really passionate about, it does not have to be community-based research. It could be gender, it could be environment, it could be anything. Trust yourself more at the beginning, because clients will have a whole bunch of people that will simply repeat what they're saying, because they're taking that mainstream approach to development themselves. So they might believe it. A lot of other people, because they're chasing the dollars. Your voice will stand out to the right people if you're authentic about where your values are and what that means for this particular initiative or project or piece of research.
Great. Thank you very much, Deb. It was fantastic, listening about your journey, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. With this, we are going to be closing today's session. Once again, thank you, Deb. Thank you, Bridging Peoples, for the fantastic work that you've been doing. Deb, if you have any resources, maybe you could probably share with the team, and we can put up on the About section in our YouTube channel. So that way, people can have a look. And yeah, I mean, thank you very much. With that, yeah, we're going to close it. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Uh, Over to you, Deb, if you have any last words.
No last words except to say thank you, everybody, for your time and your attention. Thank you all. And thank you, Pranjali, for your wonderful moderation of this session.
That's all right. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.